To flesh out 1940 and its neighboring years, we're honored to have with us this evening two of our favorite voices from WAMU, Ed Walker and Rob Bamberger. Rob Bamberger's interest in vintage jazz and swing began in 1963 at the elementary school book fair in Shaker Heights, Ohio, where he picked over the remainders on the record table after the crowd had dispersed. There he found a two-record set from the RCA Victor of broadcast performances by the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. That fateful acquisition, which cost Bamberger a dime, launched a consuming and scholarly interest in American music of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Rob came as a volunteer in 1978 and soon became host of Hot Jazz Saturday Night. Like some of his WAMU colleagues, Rob has written the notes for more than 24 CDs on a wide range of themes and performers, including the Boswell Sisters, World War II love songs, Duke Ellington, Ina Ray Hutton, and the Ozzie Nelson Orchestra. He's given talks on the history of repertory jazz and jazz in Paris between the wars. Tonight, he'll help us explore the world of the young man known as Ed Walker. As a child, Ed always dreamed of a career in broadcasting. Listening to the radio was always very important to him, and while attending American University, Walker was one of the founders of the campus radio station, which was called WAMU-AM in 1951, before the present FM station. While in college, Walker met Willard Scott, who became his good friend and radio partner for 20 years, calling themselves the Joy Boys. Walker has also worked at local stations WPGC, WMAL, and WWRC. He worked in television at WJLA from 1975 to 1980, and News Channel 8 in the early 1980s. Today, Ed Walker is the host of WAMU's long-running program, The Big Broadcast. The show, just in case there's someone in the room who hasn't heard it, features a collection of vintage radio programs from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, including Gunsmoke, The Jack Benny Show, The Lone Ranger, Suspense, Fibber, McGee and Molly, and Superman. The Big Broadcast airs Sundays from 7 to 11 and has been weekly featured on WAMU since 1964. And Ed has been at the mic since 1990. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rob Bamberger and Ed Walker.
Chairs here, and we'll get you around to the front. Okay. A little bit further to the front there.
Got it.
Good. Ed, I want to set the scene for you a little bit.
Yeah.
Nobody showed.
Yeah.
This is
that applause was a record, I think.
No, it's a very sophisticated facility. They have a laugh track. Applause. They can sweeten it if we're not very funny. So you should relax. Say anything you want.
Anything?
Yeah. We have behind you, Ed. Well, first, it's a great pleasure to be included in this series, and always for me to hang out with Ed. He keeps me around on a retainer and calls me and says. We have behind us, Ed, on the screen, a page from the 1940 census that describes the families living on Euclid Street in Washington, D.C. Good.
I know it well.
And, there we are. We've zeroed in on the Walker family. What was the address, 1218?
1218 Euclid.
And we see Edward H. Walker, who is age 7, and your sister Betty and your folks. Yeah. I don't know if I've ever asked you about your family, your parents.
Well, my father, we came out here because my dad lost his railroad job in the Depression, and he got a part-time job or a temporary job at the Railroad Retirement Board. 1936, he came out here for 6 months, and we never went home. This became home. Then he worked for the Office of Defense Transportation. Then he got out of the government and worked for the National Lumber Manufacturers Association. And that's pretty much the story.
So, like you, a long and checkered employment history.
Yeah, that's right.
And you mentioned that you lost your sister within the last...
Within the last year, yeah.
And she was about...
She was about 85, I think.
And you recently, if I might as well spill it all.
Yeah,
you
might tell everything. We have no secrets.
Okay, you recently turned...
80.
Wonderful.
I can remember when I was the new kid on the block, you know. No more.
Yeah, there are certain transitions in life. One that always made an impression on me was about turning 30, and when someone calls and says, will you help me move to another apartment in return for pizza, and I say, hell no. That's when you know you've made one.
Yeah, that's right.
And then when you wake up once and you realize your institutional memory, which is why I like hanging out with you, because you are institutional memory to institutional memory. It makes me feel better. I do want to thank National Archives staff member Connie Potter for locating Ed's 1940 census record. The station keeps somebody around to go out and locate Ed when we need him.
And I have no secrets at all here.
None whatsoever.
We're getting the witness protection program, I think.
Well, Ed, you are always very straightforward that the big broadcast for all of its many years on our station did not begin with you, but began with a man that we care a great deal about, John Hickman.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about the early
John, I first knew John, I was doing a program at WRC years ago called Granddad's Record Shop. And I would play old records. They were old then. They're ancient now. I mean, these are songs out of the 20s and stuff. And I did this old man's voice. Oh, folks, how are you? Talk like that, which is now my regular voice. But so
you just use your young man's voice the rest of the time.
So Hickman he collected records, among other things. For a teenager, he was a very interesting kid. And he came down to the station one afternoon and brought me a Paul Whiteman record of Just a Memory, 78. And that began it. And then he started hanging around with Willard and me when we were doing the Joy Boys. And he was working at WRC in the music library, and that station was celebrating its 40th anniversary. They sent John up to New York and got into the, as John called it, the archives of sound up there, where they had all the air checks on discs, transcriptions. And he got the bug. After that, he started collecting radio shows, and NBC gave all of their transcriptions, I believe, to the Library of Congress. So, but they had to make room for other things. And so they're still at the Library of Congress.
Yeah, I remember at John's memorial service, there was also a lot of talk about, I think, John's mother's cooking.
Oh, Mama Hickman, she made the best brownies in the world. And she never gave anybody the recipe, but she always remembered Willard's birthday, my birthday, Christmas, everything, with a can full of those brownies, which went over very big at the radio station, of course.
Well, you mentioned John catching the collecting bug, which can also be quite a curse. I remember something that our colleague and friend Dick Spotswood said to me many years ago when Dick was arranging to actually sell a collection that can hardly be described of the 78 RPM recordings he had gathered over the years, things that I never thought I would ever see, some of these great rarities. And I said to Dick, in the foolishness of youth, how can you possibly sell this collection? And he said, well, you wake up one morning and you realize that instead of keeping the collection is keeping you.
That's right.
And there is wisdom in that, because there comes a point when one can be very much overwhelmed by.
Yeah, well, I had to get rid of my collection when we moved. We downsized, and And it was like a part of my life going out the window, but
Yep, absolutely.
you have to do it.
Absolutely. And it's one of the great character building exercises of my life not to go and look at your collection before you disposed of it. You have to do things to keep your marriage.
Yeah.
So back there on Euclid Street, what was the role that the radio played?
Radio was, to me,
In your
it was
house.
everything. I guess my mother and father listened to it some too, but I had most of the time on the radio because I didn't use comic books or funny papers or anything like that. So I enjoyed the Jack Armstrong and the Lone Ranger and Tom Mix and all those shows. And then I got interested in the comedians and the soap operas, which my mother listened to religiously. Housewives mostly stayed home in those days, and that's why the radio soap operas became so popular. And the radio that I grew up with is now at WAMU. They're going to show it off when they move to the new studios, I think. But it was bought the year I was born.
Is this a table or a
The
console?
floor model RCA from 1932, and that's the way most people had it in their homes then. One radio, much as the early days of television, when everybody had one television set in the living room. In the old days, the family would get together around the radio and look at the dial, But it was good. Radio was great for me because it's the theater of the mind, as William N. Robeson used to call it. And it is that. You can picture in your mind's eye just about anything or any description that you want. And with the technicians, the sound men and everything made it live. They made it come alive. That was the secret of old-time radio.
You were saying that one of the very first programs you recalled listening to was the National Barn Dance.
Yeah, that was another one. That wasn't a dramatic show, but when I was about 2 years old, we lived in Illinois then, and we used to listen on Saturday night to the National Barn Dance. It was on WLS in Chicago, came out of the 8th Street Theater in Chicago, and they had people applauding and everything. And when they do a number, there was somebody that would ring a cowbell. And so my mother got me a little cowbell or something. And I was a dumb kid. I didn't know any better. So I'd ring that cowbell along with the rest of them,
Well, let's take a listen to hear what you were ringing it with.
All right.
Here's a little selection from the National Barn Dance.
Alka-Seltzer for headaches. Alka-Seltzer for acid indigestion. Alka-Seltzer for muscular aches and pains.
Ask your druggist for Alka-Seltzer.
Hello, everybody everywhere. How's Mother and Dad and the whole family? Well, folks, that old harvest moon is shining down extra bright on the old red barn tonight, and for a very special reason. Yes, the Alka-Seltzer National Barn Dance Gang is celebrating its 9th birthday. Its 470th Happy Hayloft Party from the old WLS Hayloft in Chicago. So come right on in, folks, and join our 9th birthday. We're celebrating it with a harvest home party. Oh, say, the old hayloft is going to shine tonight, folks. We go back 470 barn dances, folks, to the first song sung for the first time on your first hayloft party. The tune fit as a fiddle. The singers, Hezzy, Kenny, Frank, and Gaby, the Hoosier Hot Shots. Are you ready, Hezzy? Okay, let's go. I could jump over the moon up above, fiddle the fiddle and ready for love. Having a worry, having a care, feel like a feather that's floating on air, fiddle the fiddle and ready for love.
The Jello program.
Up, good. Okay, there we go.
Jump the gun.
So you said the host of the program was...
Joe Kelly, who later became the host of the Quiz Kids show.
I see.
And when I was a kid, he did a morning show on WLS where he had a dressing contest, and he would look in his magic looking glass. The women, the girls would win one day, the boys would win the next day. That's the way radio was in those days.
And the National Barn Dance, it was not all really bucolic. The
No.
Dinning sisters were on there?
The Denning sisters were on there. Henry Burr, the Dean of American Ballad Singers.
Going back.
Billy Murray was on there.
These were all
Eddie Peabody, the
early
banjo
recording
kid.
artists. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was sort of a Midwestern Grand Ole Opry, if you will, a little more sophisticated.
You said that your mom listened to a program that is conventionally tends to be described as an early soap opera, although you've suggested that might not be an
Well-
entirely fair description of Clara, Lou, and M.
Yeah, that was I think Merton and Marge was probably the first real soap opera, but Clara and Lou and M was out of Chicago. My mother listened to that. It's about 3 housewives and their daily problems, and they would just talk a little bit, and it lasted for a long time. And this program was from the early 1930s, and I believe it was on NBC.
Yeah, apparently, I looked it up. It started out as a skit in a sorority
Yeah.
house. The 3 women, Louise Starkey, Isabel Carruthers, Helen King, and their friends encouraged them to try to get it onto WGN. And then, as you say, it was picked up by NBC. We have an excerpt, I guess, from actually a 1930 audition that was prepared for it. Let's see if we can catch that next.
So let's meet them now, the most humorous, the most lovable trio that ever settled the nation's problems. Here they are, Clara, Lou, and M.
Oh, dear. Ernest should have stayed home tonight. We got something important we got to talk over. I'm so ashamed of him.
Oh, again.
Why, Lou, I ain't never been ashamed of Ernest.
Oh, you have
Why,
to.
Ann?
Lots of times.
Why, I have not. This is the first time.
Oh, well, I guess this is the first time you've ever spoke right out about it.
Well, yes, Lou, that may be, but my stars. Just as soon as she said she was so ashamed of Ernest, I wish you could have saw what come up in my mind. I always picture Ernest as being out of work and then turning down a perfectly good job. I remember once he could have been a streetcar conductor, but he never took it. I had to stand up, all the time he took the fares, and then another time...
my goodness. I never seen the beat of you girls. I was speaking in the laughing mode about being ashamed. Yeah, the person just says something in a laughing mode, and you pick it up and shake it. Really, Clara, I never seen the beat of you for bringing out a person's skeletons in their closets. You seem like you just step into my home and open doors and skeletons falls out all over the house.
Yes. Well, that's more or less because I know you so good.
Well, is there any interest in what I was saying laughingly?
Oh, sure. Let's get back to Em's joke. Come on now, Em. Crack your joke.
Oh, dear. I wasn't going to be able to say
Well, that it wouldn't make it today, I don't think. But my mom thought it was terrific,
Well, apparently, Isabel Carruthers died unexpectedly in 1936, and the other her two collaborators, didn't want to go on.
Yeah,
And so it did go on a hiatus for some years,
and it came back.
but not for long, apropos your comment. Apparently, they improvised quite a bit of it based on things that were in the news, and so. But you say your mom was one of its.
Oh, yeah, she
followers.
loved it, yeah.
Well, you said
That was her time with the radio, I think, then.
Well, you said you got interested in soaps. What were some of the early soaps that
Well,
caught
when you're,
you?
there was Ma Perkins, of course. Aunt Jenny's Real Life Stories. Helen Trent was well past 35 when she found romance, I think. And there was, the soap operas ran from about 9 in the morning, and they took a break at noon, and then they ran till about 6 in the evening. I mean, they were on all day, 15-minute shows, one right after another. And they kept the actors originally from Chicago. Before they got the switching capabilities on the network, all of these shows came out of the Midwest in Chicago. And then they moved to New York when they got the capability of switching coast to coast with the telephone lines, and then Chicago ceased to be the capital that it once was. Fibber, McGee, and Molly came from Chicago. Vic and Sade originally came from Chicago. A lot of shows started out in Chicago.
Well, you said something very interesting at the start about how the development and the success of soap operas was very much a reflection of American society and the fact that women were in the home. And here we find we are bearing witness now to the end of the last of the television soap operas for the very same reason.
And the soap operas and radio, they used a lot of innuendos, but they never came right out.
Does anyone have a dictionary? Innuendo.
Well, on television these days, they show couples in bed and everything else, which they never did on radio. They would insinuate. That's what they did.
Still in the eyes. Insinuate.
Yeah. It's sort of like the other word I used.
Yes. You're, I think, sort of referencing subtlety.
Yeah, that's a good word. Yeah, subtlety.
Which you feel was more artful in radio.
Oh, easily. Yeah. They had censors at the radio networks that were very cautious. When I first went to NBC, they had a guy who was in charge of standards and practices.
That was the word for it, wasn't it?
Yeah, and then you had to be very careful. And our show, being the kind of a show that it was, we had to watch. Kind of watch what we did. And we kept the legal department going for years up there.
Give us an example if you're not being altogether facetious.
Well, one time we had a spot was sold for, I'll say Charmin's. It wasn't, but Charmin's toilet paper. And there was a note on the copy to Willard, no ad-libbing. So we ad-libbed, that's what we did. And then one time we were filling out, we had some time to kill, and I had some public service announcements. I handed Willard one, and it was for a bingo contest, a bingo game, but it was at a Jewish home. You think of bingos at Catholic churches, don't you? Well, somebody who had worked for the FCC got fired and didn't, they were taking it out on us. They reported us to the radio station, and the FCC got involved, and the management of the station got all over us for doing that. And we were innocent, But that's what
you were innocent of that particular...
Yeah, that time.
Okay.
Time.
All right. Just wanted to be clear. When do you remember starting to listen to some of the prominent radio comedians?
Oh, boy. I'd say about from 1940, 41. I finally got a radio that I had in my bedroom, and I would listen to Bob Hope, of course, Bing Crosby, Bergen and McCarthy, Jack Benny, Phil Harris. Well, he didn't have a show then. He was on Benny's show.
Right.
And Fibber and Molly.
Well, you've aired some very lengthy runs of Jack Benny on the big broadcast over the years. We have a very compelling excerpt from a Jack Benny program from 1937 that speaks to the long-running feud with Fred Allen.
Oh, yes, that was a famous feud, and it all started because Fred Allen had a boy violinist on his show, and he played a song called The Bee. And Fred Allen made the comment, Jack Benny ought to be ashamed of himself. He still can't play that song. And Benny, of course, would listen to the show and write an ad-lib for the next week. And so the feud began, and it went on for, a couple of years.
Well, what we have tonight is an excerpt from a show that's very, very early in this feud. Jack had taken the program east, and this is only weeks after Fred Allen had made that comment, and about a week or two after Jack had played the Bee himself on the show. So we're going to hear a bit of dialogue from that. One thing that really is interesting about this is that usually the announcers don't get into any of the feuding, but I guess
Don Wilson.
Yeah, Harry Von Zell was
Von Zell.
was Fred's
That's
announcer.
right, he was Fred's announcer.
And there's some reference, and you'll get to hear how Don reacts to that. There's a little bit of audio whistle during part of this, but this is so priceless because of its being right at the start of the feud. So here is Jack Benny's program in 1937, March probably.
The Jello program, coming to you from the Grand Ballroom of the Hotel Pierre, starring Jack Benny with Mary Livingston and Abe Lyman and his orchestra. We bring you a fellow who is a big man in Hollywood, a giant in Waukegan, but just another actor in New York, Jack Benny.
Hello again. This is Jack Benny coming to you from the Grand Ballroom of the Hotel Pierre. And listen, Don, I'm not such a small guy in New York either.
Well, then, Jack, how come they won't even let you broadcast from the NBC studios? First, you're at the Waldorf Astoria, now the Pierre.
Well, it's because NBC is crowded, that's why.
Well, how long are you going to stay in New York, anyway?
Until we run out of hotels. I've been hanging around so many ballrooms, I feel like a chandelier. Anyway, Don, it's still a distinction to be able to do our program from here. Not every entertainer would be granted that privilege, particularly one that I know of.
Mm-hmm. And who's that, Jack?
Well, I don't want to mention any names, but I don't see how Harry Von Zell can laugh at him every Wednesday night.
Oh, Von Zell, that announcer.
Yeah.
By the way, Jack, did you hear Alan call you a bully last Wednesday?
Better than being a scaredy cat.
How do you know?
Oh, Don, he's an awful baby. Imagine a grown man taking ether when he gets a manicure. Anyway, I don't want Alan's name mentioned anymore on this program.
Hey, what's going on in here?
Well, as I live and regret that there are no locks on studio doors.
You heard that. Two receptions.
Now, listen, Alan, what's the idea of breaking in here in the middle of my singing?
Singing?
Yes.
Now, listen, Betty. Why, you make Andy Devine sound like Lawrence Tibbett.
Now, look here, Alan. I don't care what you say about my singing or my violin playing on your own program. But when you come up here, be careful. After all, I've got listeners.
Keep your family out of this.
Listen. My family likes my singing and my violin playing, too.
Your violin playing?
Yeah.
You are using the verb loosely, Mr. Benson. Why, if I was a horse, if I was a pony even, and found out that my tail... found out that any part of my tail was being used in your violin bow, I'd hang my head in my oat bag from then on.
Well, you listen to me, you Wednesday night hawk. Another crack like that and Town Hall will be looking for a new janitor.
Why, you lay a hand on me. You lay a hand on me. Anything we'll say accidentally will be better than the script.
The writers in those days were just superb. And, of course, they were masters of ad-libbing, as you hear with Fred Allen. I did a commercial one time with Kenny Delmar, who was Senator Claghorn, and he was the announcer on the show, and I asked him about that. He said, Fred Allen would give you all sorts of liberties to do with the character what you wanted to do, but you never tried to top Fred Allen, he'd kill you.
Yeah. One of the things that I think part of the joy of hearing these performers go off script is just their own merriment.
Yeah.
I mean, you can hear Mary Livingston.
And it was live. It was live.
Yeah. At the end of that particular sequence, Jack and Fred make up, but they must have realized there was no upside to that. And they were back at it pretty quickly. One performer that was very much a part of the scene through much of your professional life in the early decades, but also one figure who became an object of yours and Willard's own satire is Arthur Godfrey.
Oh, yes. Godfrey was the morning man, did a program called The Sundial at WJSV. Now, originally, he'd worked for NBC and was in a terrible automobile accident in the early 30s and was confined to the hospital for months, at which time he got a radio and listened to the radio, and he was appalled to hear the formality of the announcers. You know, the National Broadcasting Company, you know, these formal guys. They used to come to work in tuxedos, I understand. And he said, if I ever get back out here and get on the air, I'm going to change this. Well, he got out, and he got on the air, and he created the, I don't know what you'd call it, the personal approach to radio. And I can give you one example. He was famous for missing commercials. And locally, there was a Smith's Transfer and Storage Company and the Chambers Undertakers. And he forgot to do it. He said, I got 2 spots I didn't get in here. He says, don't make a move without calling Smith's. And if you can't, call Chambers. That's the kind of stuff he did. And this was a morning show on WJSV, and you can hear him, I think, the way he was originally wanting to do before he got all the stardom and glamour. This is on a day, it's September the 21st, 1939, on WJSV. Here's Arthur Godfrey.
And this is sort of an extraordinary occasion because this is sort of known as the day that was recorded. The entire broadcast proceedings of the day were recorded.
From sign-on to sign-off.
Right, and there's a couple of curious things just to flag before we hear it. Arthur clearly knew that it was being recorded because in this sort of cobbled together excerpt, he does make reference to posterity, though he is very vague about it, and certainly listeners would have had no sense of the reference he was going to be making. And just to make sense of one or two other things he brings up, he talks about a very big 1939 MGM movie, The Women, which of course TCM screens often, based on a play by Claire Booth Luce wrote the play, The Women, but it has an all-female cast, which figures in his remarks. But the most interesting thing, and I know you can add some details to this, is that you will hear Arthur Godfrey talking about Leesburg Pike.
Which he lived in Leesburg, and of course they were developing Leesburg Pike. He commuted every day from his farm down there to the Earl Building, where WJSV was located, 13th and E, I think it was. And he'd come in every day, and he talks about this pike, turnpike.
Yeah. And then there's something else that happens here.
I don't want to give it away. You got to listen. And
absolutely.
Listen very carefully. And this was unrehearsed, I am sure.
Okay. We were debating this.
Yeah.
Arthur Godfrey.
6:29 and a half. Good morning, one and all. 'Tis the Sundial, WJSV, Washington, D.C. This is Thursday morning, September the 21st. If I am not took with a mistake, this is the autumnal equinox, isn't it? Today?
Yeah, it would be.
This is the first day of fall officially, isn't it?
That's 21, yeah.
I do believe it is. I sort of had a hunch. Hey, you know, Pilcher? Pilcher? I have a funny feeling this morning that my few words here are being set aside, so to speak, for posterity. I don't know why. Would you care to come and say a few words for posterity? Let me see what else is there here. What you should know about which you should. Oh, yes. A little message here from my neighbors out there in Virginia. The council of the town of Leesburg and the Leesburg Rotary Club have adopted resolutions urging the State Highway Commission of the Commonwealth of Virginia to take steps to improve Virginia Route number 7. That's the Leesburg Pike, you know. Between Clark's Gap and Falls Church. Now, the chairman of the Highway Commission is urged to arrange for a public hearing of all governmental bodies, civic organizations, and their representatives. Let us all inform the chairman of the Highway Commission of our interest in the improvement of the Leesburg Pike. The traffic on that road nowadays is something terrific. It would be nice if we could get it widened. Those blind hills and curves taken out of it. Huh? It says here, Arthur, please announce that there will be a midnight show tonight of the women. And how about the women treating the men to this show? It says, talking about style, wait till you see that gorgeous $250 nightgown that is part of the Technicolor fashion show in the new picture, The Women. Fancy that, paying $250 for a nightie. Huh? Mine costs $1.50, and I bet I sleep better than she does. I bet you. Norma Shearer, Joan Crawford, Rosalind Russell head 100% female cast. Did you see the play? Oh, boy, the gossip and the rumor and the scandal flies on the wings of the wittiest dialogue you've ever heard. Luxury beauty parlors, homes, and hotels. Oh, pardon me. I've always wondered what I'd do if I had to sneeze on the air. Now I know. Where was I? The Women, the picture you must see, opens tomorrow at Lowe's Palace Theater. It's quite a picture. Quite a picture. $250 for a nightie.
That was a style that a lot of people tried to emulate over the years, but he kind of created that approach on radio, and it served him very well. You got to admit that.
Do you think there was anyone any more interested than he was that something be done about Route 7?
I don't know. He drove it every day. That's
Yeah, he certainly was certainly posturing as if he was doing a real public service, putting that in the show that day.
Yeah, well.
But I was asking Ed, he alludes to the fact that the show is being recorded, and that's the same day that he sneezes on the air. And so we were debating.
Well, you notice the way he said hotel, you could hear the grabbing in his voice when he was saying luxury hotel, and you can't recreate that. He had it was real.
Okay, well,
I'm sure it was real.
You would know. And as I mentioned earlier, that his reputation began to sort of develop an edge to it. Some people say that the character that Andy Griffith plays in, let's see, what is the title of that?
Facing the Crowd.
Yeah, Facing the Crowd. And then there's that wonderful film, The Great Man, with Jose Ferrer and Edwin, that the media characters depicted in those movies that bore some resemblance to how Arthur Godfrey was understood to be.
He was possessive of his talent, and he resented the fact when Julius LaRosa went out and got an agent. Godfrey served as the agent. He never took a fee from them, but like the McGuire sisters, they got billings by being on his show. And he resented the fact that LaRosa, who was a young singer, was getting more fan mail than he was, so he fired Julius on the air. We don't have that recording here, but they said...
It always makes Ed and me nervous to hear anything where someone's being fired on the air.
Yeah. I've been there and done that. But
well, I guess I'm doing all right.
Yeah. The story goes that LaRosa heard him. He had Julius do the last song on the show before they were to sign off. And then Godfrey says, after tonight, Julius going on his own. He's going to be so forth and so on. And Julius said to somebody, did I just get fired? Which he did.
Yeah. What prompted you and Willard to begin to do some satire?
Well, he was such
Arthur?
a big figure, and Willard did a beautiful Godfrey imitation, and Willard always liked Arthur Godfrey. In fact, he had Godfrey sign a dollar bill that was the first dollar bill he earned from NBC. They paid him in those days. He was a page, and they paid him in cash. He saved that first dollar. He had Godfrey sign it. Then one time David Sarnoff was in town. And Willard went to Sarnoff. He said, Mr. Sarnoff, I have the first dollar bill I ever made here. Would you sign it for me? He says, you got the first dollar bill you made here? Yes, sir. He said, you're losing interest.
Well, that explains why he was David Sarnoff and the rest of us.
Yeah.
The rest of us weren't. How did you start to then begin to carve out a career in radio yourself?
Well, I started out with and Willard started out the same way. I had a little, for Christmas one year, when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I got a small, what they called a phono oscillator. And you could hook your phonograph to it and hear it all through the house with no wires. Oh. And I hooked a microphone up to it. And then I figured, well, if I put an aerial on it, it might get further, which I did. And I went down the street, and I could be heard at the neighbor's house. So I'd go down there and knock on the door. I'm going on the air in about a half hour. All right, kid. So I did that. That's how I started. And then we had a dear friend of the family who was an engineer for WOL, and he would take me with him on remote broadcasts. And that was fascinating to me. Huh. And then when I got old enough to want to decide what I wanted to do, I wanted to be in radio, hoping that there was something I could do. And so I listened to the radio so much. And then I met Willard in college. And, of course, he opened a lot of doors for me because they wouldn't have hired me on my own. But the fact that we were working together made a big difference. In fact, you had to fill out a log when you do commercials, the Times. Mm-hmm. And they would always say, Walker, did you sign this log, or was that Willard who did that? His handwriting wasn't the greatest,
Just talk about the discovery that you and Willard made of the chemistry that seems to have always come so naturally between the two.
It was natural. And the first time I met Willard, I was a year ahead of him at American University. And we had a mutual friend named Roger Gordon, who later became Dr. Gordon in audiovisual at Temple. Uh-huh. And Roger always talked like Henry Aldrich to me. Gee whiz, he would say. Even when he was a man. Hi. So he got Willard, Roger talked Willard into coming out and looking at the university. While he was there, we had this little radio station. We were just trying to get off the ground. And he brought Willard in there, and he said, Willard, go in there and sit across the table from Walker and say something. He can't see anyway. So say something smart and see what happens. And he did, and I responded, and he responded. And I don't remember what we said, but that's how the Joy Boys were born. Huh. On the air, literally.
Literally on the air. And some of the sketches, you would sort of just have a theme in mind. And I say this in such a tentative way because I can't imagine flying without a net the way it's my understanding.
Yeah, we did that. Well, Willard would write little notes to himself, like names.
Which did you a lot of good, the little written notes.
I counted on him to do that. And we worked it down to a fairly well. In other words, my hand would be on the table. If he wanted to cut in, so he'd rap me on the back of the knuckles with a pencil. Uh-huh. In other words, shut up, I got something to say. Uh-huh. And then he'd jump in the first chance he got. And that's the way we did it, and it worked.
Except that your hand got kind of
after my hands were sore, but that's all right.
Yeah. Well, it's remarkable. I mean, I would think of just some lines from some of the sketches. Whatever Lola wants, Stan gets.
Yes.
And to think that those things just sort of were
But that stuff wouldn't go over today. We've talked about this a lot.
Well, you just heard people laugh when I quoted it, though.
Yeah. But, I guess, we weren't suggestive enough. We were naughty, but we weren't like Howard Stern, I mean, he points it right out there for you, But we would there again, make innuendos, I guess. And the adults would, listen to those guys. And the kids didn't get it anyway. So we appealed to cross generations, old folks or older folks and the kids.
Yeah, be careful.
Yeah. They liked the stupid stuff we did, which was most of the stuff we did.
But it was, did you sometimes sort of, because you were on 5 days?
4 hours a day,
Yeah.
5 days a week.
So after you got off the air, did you sometimes sit and maybe brainstorm a few things for the next?
No, we didn't.
See, that's...
I'd go home, my wife would give me the dickens because I wouldn't talk. And I said, listen, I talk all day. I'm tired I want to listen. So that's, But no, we'd go our separate ways, and then Willard would come in. We'd get together about an hour before the show, and talk it over. And while the records were on, we actually played records in those days. We'd come with the order of what we're like the soap opera as the worm turns. We had a throat doctor who was this top 40 DJ had lost his voice, and we had this throat doctor, Dr. Clayton Jackson Durante was his name. And he would say, "What do you want, Julia? You got a bad throat?" So we get a whole week out of that. Just the setup and the ending. You know how soap operas are.
Yeah.
There's only about a few seconds of dialogue, and Willard would set it up now. The sponsor was Scuff No More. You sprayed it on your kids to guard against abrasions. That was Willard's creation. But I'll tell you a story if we got time.
Oh, yeah.
As the worm turns, one of the first ones we did, we had a doctor named Dr. Kaleo. And Dr. Kaleo was, to say the least, kind of a shyster. He wouldn't. And so we Dr. Ernest Kaleo, I'll never forget it. We did the show, and the phone rang, and the NBC people upstairs, "You got to change that doctor's name. His lawyer just called." And he said, "You're prejudicing his case." And I said, "What case?" "Well, he's being up on a malpractice suit." So a couple of years later,
What are the odds of that?
Yeah. I'm at WMAL, and I met a young intern, and she said, "My mother said to tell you hello." I said, "I don't believe I know your mother." She said, "Well, she knows you. She was Dr. Kaleo's secretary." True story.
And had she been looking for a job for a while?
And she didn't say that.
One genre of our late friend Jerry Gray used to really bristle if anyone used the word genre. So I still catch myself sometimes, but certainly one form of radio entertainment, quiz shows, some of which were quiz shows in the standard way, but others that were not, such as Information Please.
A very erudite show. If there had been an NPR in those days, that would have been the network for it.
Yeah.
Clifton Fadiman was the narrator, not the narrator, but
the host.
The host. And he had a series of guests, Franklin P. Adams and a couple others. Oscar Levant was a frequent guest. Milton Cross was the announcer, who was one of the dean of American announcers. Milton Cross. And this was, I guess, Information Please went on the air in 1938.
Yeah, and it did sort of turn things on its head insofar as instead of asking people like V and me questions, people like V and me sent questions in that would be posed to a panel of experts. And I gather that Franklin P. Adams was really an extraordinary figure, long-standing career in American journalism.
Yeah, John Kieran,
who was
one of them was a sports addict, and he'd answer all the sports questions.
But he apparently also had knowledge in a number of other areas. And of course, Oscar.
And listen to
Levant.
the money that they awarded. I mean,
Yes.
$5, $10.
Yes.
I mean, chump change nowadays, you know.
Right. If you sent a question in and the panel couldn't answer it, you would be sent $5, and they would even include the sound of a cash drawer, as if to be heavy-handed about this $5 going out. But we have a little excerpt from an early information, please, to run for you now.
Information, please. Wake up, America. Time to stump the experts. This is the program in which you, the public, turn the tables on the authorities. Send us questions with the right answers. Each question accepted wins you $2. You can win, therefore, as much as $7 per question if you're lucky and Information, please, is not. Our master of ceremonies is Clifton Fadiman, literary critic of the New Yorker magazine. Mr. Fadiman.
Thank you, Mr. Cross. Good evening, everybody. May I introduce our 3 wise men and 1 wise woman. Our 2 old faithfuls are with us again, Mr. Franklin P. Adams, columnist of the New York Post, and John Kieran, sports expert, paleontologist, hi, pal, and walking encyclopedia. Information, please, is glad to welcome back Mr. Oscar Levant, musical expert, composer, pianist, and he takes special pleasure in announcing as its 4th guest the star of stage and screen, whose charm is exactly equal to her ability, both of them being almost unmeasurable, Miss Lillian Gish. You were supposed to listen to that, Miss Gish. And now, Miss Gish and gentlemen, the first question comes from Mr. William Halsey of Boston, Massachusetts. I'll ask you to try to give me 5 typical commonplace remarks or cliches used by the family and its members in the home. For example, the one I remember best is the one I used to say always when I was a small boy. Did I ask to be born? Let's have 5 of them. Mr. Levant.
Hey, are you going to stay in that bathroom all day?
Very good. Any family that has a bathroom has heard that said. Mr. Adams.
He got a bigger piece of ice cream than I did.
Perfectly true. 2, Mr. Levant.
Stop picking on me.
Had a terrible home life, Mr. Levant. That's correct, though. 3, Mr. Kieran.
It's good, but it's not like what Mother used to make.
Very good. That's 4. Miss Gish, have you had no home life?
Where were you last night?
Yes, that's perfectly all right.
John Kieran apparently commented once that, and I'll quote, an uproarious error or a brilliant bit of irreverence was rated far above any dull delivery of truth. Oscar Levant was such a, well, where are the words? I mean, this is, after all, is the guy who said there's a fine line between genius and insanity. I have erased that line.
Yeah. Yeah, he had his problems, for sure.
He did, and today we would recognize it as that he was bipolar, and as so much of his on-air character and personality was rooted in his struggles.
See, the times were a lot different then, and it was a gentler age, actually. We didn't talk about that stuff.
Well, he did, but
well, I guess he did.
But you're right that no one would have made the point of it that he did.
Yeah.
He did it so charmingly. He no doubt raised some consciousness and awareness of those things. One other thing that he quipped that I've always liked was something he said about Elizabeth Taylor, always the bride and never the bridesmaid.
Yeah. Was he the guy who said about Darcy?
Oh, yes.
I knew her before she was a virgin. No.
Yeah. No, he was, and of course, it isn't really a joke.
Yeah.
He was with her in the very first movie she made, Romance on the High Seas, which, if next time TCM shows it, if you have not seen that movie, try to watch the first 5 minutes and think of when Doris Day comes on like a saucy wench chewing gum and calling people chum, and I mean, it is not Please Don't Eat the Daisies. It's, you know, her whole persona changed. I was just reading the other day that she had been approached about taking the role of Mrs. Robinson in The Graduate, and she and her husband refused the idea that it could have been really a role.
She
that
was the girl next door. You wouldn't. That would be opposite of typecasting for sure.
it might, though, have led to a whole different dimension for her, but she couldn't sort of absorb Oscar Levant's wisdom, I guess, and go back. But if you can see Romance on the High Seas, just the first 10 minutes, that's all you have to look at. Some of the major stars that you had the chance to interview over the years, was Crosby among them?
On the phone. I didn't meet him in person.
Okay.
But we were going to do a show. I was doing a television show then, AM Washington on WJLA. And we were doing a show on Al Jolson. And Al Jolson had a half-brother who lived in Washington. Yes. And we were going to get him on. And I said, we're having a program meeting. And I said, what we need is Bing Crosby. He knew Jolson pretty well. And everybody said, yeah, get him. And I said, all right, I will. So I found we had a book we subscribed to called it gave the agent's number of all the actors or their office numbers. So I called Crosby's office and I talked to a very nice woman. And I said what I was doing. I said, I'd like to set up an interview with Bing Crosby if we could. Well, she says, he's not in town right now, but I'll give me your number and I'll call you when he's available. And the next day, I was out of the office and she called. And I got the message when lady called from Bing Crosby's office and you weren't here. And I was really, oh no, I missed him. Oh gee. So she said, I'll do something I very rarely do. She said, I'll give you his home phone number. I said, I got Bing's home phone number? But you got to call him early in the morning. He's an early riser. I said, no problem. He's in California. I'm in New York. If I call him about 9 a.m. here, it'd be 6 a.m. there. So I called, and his British butler answered the phone. Crosby residence? I said, my name is Ed Walker. I'm calling from Channel 7, so forth and so on. And I'd like to be able to talk to Mr. Crosby. Oh, yes, I saw your name on his spindle. I said, I'm on Bing Crosby's spindle. These are the things you're thinking at this time. And I got him on the phone. I was petrified. Mr. Crosby, I said, for purposes of this interview, can I call you Bing? And he said, oh, yeah. He said, of course. I wouldn't know how to answer if you didn't. He was very nice. And he even sent me a letter for interviewing him, which is unheard of. I should have sent him a letter. But I have that somewhere. I treasure that.
Yeah, and he would apparently sit at his typewriter and tap these things out.
Then we also interviewed Bob Hope. I met him on a couple of occasions. And, there's so many. I was talking to Jerry Vale one time on the phone. I was just new at a little station. And I was talking about Jerry's appearing at the Casino Royal. I'm sure the food is good. You'll love Jerry Gray there. Jerry Gray, listen to me. Jerry Vale. He said, I'm sure that's a good place, but I'm at the Lotus. It was my face red, I'll tell you.
Well, Bing Crosby certainly is one of the towering icons of radio. I mean, he was huge in everything, but really dominated radio for decades.
Well, he started out with Paul Whiteman, of course, and the Rhythm Boys.
Right.
And then he joined Gus Arnheim's orchestra. And he had a habit of getting soused, if you will, not showing up, and that's how Russ Columbo got started. Russ Columbo was a violinist.
With Arnheim, wasn't he?
Yeah, and Arnheim would use him as a vocalist while Bing was in absentia.
In absentia. Well, Crosby goes on the radio, network radio, for the first time, I guess, 1931. Harry Von Zell announcing for him.
15-minute show.
And then it's early 1936 that Bing takes over the Kraft Music Hall, which was apparently hosted by his previous, one of his prior employers, Paul Whiteman.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting early Crosby that has surfaced in recent years, and some of which has been privately issued to Crosby collectors. We've got just a couple of minutes worth by way of example coming up here. This is from December of 1935. Paul Whiteman is hosting the program from the East Coast, and Bing is brought in from the West Coast, and a few weeks later would take over hosting the Kraft Music Hall and would do so for, what, until the mid-40s? Yeah. So we'll hear him sing a very appropriate song for the influence that Bing had on popular music. It's Learn to Croon. And then something from a very brief performance from a 1932 show from Los Angeles, the Union Oil Dominoes program. You'll hear Bing singing Some of These Days, which is one of those songs that he sang that really show his jazz chops.
Yeah.
And I think, Ed, you will be the arbiter of this, that even in 1935, that it's Ken Carpenter who is announcing for the music hall.
It could very well be, because he used Carpenter. He was very loyal to his announcers. Carpenter worked with him his whole career.
Yeah, but this is even before Bing took over. Let's take a listen to this then.
The Greater Kraft Music Hall. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, the Kraft Music Hall brings you the first of a series of shows featuring that popular radio and screen favorite, Bing Crosby, co-starring with Paul Whiteman and the brilliant Whiteman Ensemble. And here's Paul.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. And welcome to the Kraft Music Hall. Tonight's a mighty big night for me and for you, too, I'm sure. Because we would have with us one of Hollywood's greatest stars, Bing Crosby. As a matter of fact, Bing's not really in the music hall tonight, he's in Hollywood. Ladies and gentlemen, here's Bing Crosby.
In a picture, College Humor, I first introduced a little song. If you recognize the melody, why don't you hum along and learn to croon? If you want to win your heart's desire, sweet melodies of love inspire romance. Oh, just whisper da-da-dee-da-da-da-da-dee. And when you do, she'll whisper da-da-dee, da-da-dee, and she'll nestle closer to you. Yeah, da-da-da-dee. Mm-hmm. If you're heading for a sunny honeymoon, learn to croon.
Now, Bing, what are you going to sing next?
I'd like to sing that old favorite, Jack. Some of These Days.
I'll stick around till you sing it.
Don't get hurt. Some of these days, you're gonna miss me, honey. Some of these days, you're gonna be so lonely. You'll miss my hugging, I'm gonna miss my kissing. You'll be so sorry when I'm away. Now you're gonna be lonely, just for me only. 'Cause you know, honey, that you had your way. And when you leave me, you know it's gonna grieve me. You'll miss your little daddy some of these days. Now you're gonna be lonely, just for me only. 'Cause you know, honey, that you had your way. And when you leave me, you know it's gonna grieve me. You'll miss your little sweet.
Yeah, he loved musicians, and he did have that jazz influence. He was doing scat before Ella, wasn't he?
Well, he was certainly among the early and true scatters.
Yeah.
With him on that performance was guitarist Eddie Lang, who was his accompanist until Eddie's very untimely death in March of 1933. And you were speaking about Bing's loyalty to performers, and the pianist was Lenny Hayton. Mm-hmm. But just an incredible performer, and Bing also had a real strong sense of vaudeville, his sense of comedy, his use of language. And you've played a lot of Bing Crosby, Kraft, and other radio series programs on the big broadcast.
Yeah, he had a great, he could articulate very well. He'd been a debater, I think, in high school, and that sort of came naturally to him.
It's interesting to think that while Bing brought so much to radio from, I guess, my own perspective, he also took something out of radio because he was the first to insist on transcribing his weekly broadcast because he did not want to be enslaved to the live mic.
Like to play golf.
Right. He was one of the early investors in the tape recorder. And so his shows after I wish I knew the exact
1947, I think.
That sounds right.
That's when the Philco series started.
Okay, and those were transcribed. And they just don't quite sound the same because of the transcribed, the editing. As gifted as his editors were, there is something that one senses to be a little different. With respect to thinking about the lengthy runs on the big broadcast of Jack Benny or Bing Crosby or Johnny Dollar or Dragnet, what are some of the things that influence the decisions you make about what to run, just some of the shows you may run?
Some of the shows were a carryover from when John Hickman did it. Of course, Gunsmoke is probably the most listened to of the shows I do. And we've gone back recently and started that series all over again. And we try to mix a little comedy and a little mystery and everything else. And you never can please everybody. Some people send me emails, there's not enough comedy. Somebody else said, there's too much comedy, more science fiction. More, you can't please everybody. So in the course of 4 hours, we try to do it the best we can. And the final hour, we run a lot of times the Lux Radio Theater, which is sort of a composite of all sorts of things. Because that's the time when people are going to bed. And, I don't use the prime shows in that time slot.
Well, Mr. DeMille might take exception to that, but...
Good night to you from Hollywood. Yeah.
But what Ed has just mentioned brings to mind something I do want to share with everyone. One of the things that I remember when, after John Hickman died, there was a very nice memorial service, and the program director at the time at WAMU, Steve Martin. Steve Palmer, I don't know which to call him, Palmer, Martin. Steve stood up and said that the big broadcast delivered to him what every program director of a radio station wanted on Sunday nights, and that was an audience. It is a very narrow time for radio listening. There's not a large Sunday evening radio audience. But the big broadcast has, over its lifetime, delivered with exceptional consistency, a very strong and a very loyal listenership. And indeed, we would note that since the mechanism by which audience numbers are measured was changed a few years ago, just looking at WAMU's fall 2011 and winter 2012 book, The big broadcast is, Ed can't see what I'm doing, but I'm holding up one finger, and not, it's an okay finger.
Which finger is that?
I'll speak with you later.
Oh, all right.
Number one.
But I can't take the credit for that. It's the programs that the people listen to. I just tie them together, so I can't take a lot of credit for it. I'm blessed to have a lot of material to use.
Well, I grant what you say, because to the extent that anyone has ever talked about my own show, I also will give full credit to the musicians, and usually people will say, well, I hope you would. But still, Ed, as you've heard me say on many, many occasions, and I can find any other way to say it, you personify so much of the history of radio. You help us forge a connection to it. You created so much of that history. You are part of it. And the connection that you feel with the programs is so apparent that I think everyone here would probably agree with me that there is a point at which we cannot completely separate you from the big broadcast.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, thank you.
And I see that time and time again. If one story, if I may, I tell on myself with respect to what Ed said about Gunsmoke. A few years ago, Ed, you were sidelined by some back difficulty.
Yeah.
And I was there the night of the membership campaign with Sam Litzinger to encourage people to become members. Well, you don't want to hear that language, but we could recite a phone number for you. But anyway,
202-885-8850.
That number again.
202-885-8850. It's etched in my mind. If they ever change the phone number, I'm dead.
Ran long the first hour and started Gunsmoke about 10 minutes after 8 o'clock. Well, I don't know, Letty, whether you were there that night, came in and told me the irate calls that were coming in because I had let the start of Gunsmoke slip 10 minutes. And of course, my riposte to that was, if it's so important to you, then you should be a member.
Yeah. Well, it's appointment listening. It really is. That show would not go every day of the week, but on Sunday night, it's a perfect time of the week to do this.
Yes.
Because people are unwinding from the weekend, getting ready for the upcoming week, and it's kind of a nice time.
Yeah, and the great thing is that the music fills, that's when you can run the faucet or do other things,
Yeah,
and then you turn it
that's
off.
right.
And that does also, yes. I always thought that was what This American Life was so great at 6 p.m. on Sundays when you were fixing dinner, because there was all these music, that you could cut the onions during then I lost that battle.
Yeah.
We want to slip in maybe just one more program excerpt, because I certainly want you to have an opportunity to ask some questions of Ed, as I'm sure you have of him. The Lone Ranger.
Lone Ranger goes back to 1933 and created by Fran Stryker, George W. Trendle, who owned WXYZ in Detroit, started that as a sort of an experiment. From that came the Green Hornet, Challenge of the Yukon, and countless shows. And there were several Lone Rangers. The one that is most familiar is Brace Beamer, who originally was the announcer on the show. The guy that you'll hear at the beginning of this is Earl Grazer, who was the Lone Ranger until 1941, and he was killed in an automobile accident in April of that year. And then they got Brace Beamer to take over the part of the Masked Man, and he did it actually longer than Grazer for the whole rest of the show.
It's interesting. We suggested finding an excerpt where there's a passage in which the Lone Ranger is expressing the kind of value system that we associate with the Lone Ranger. And what we have here is almost 8 stories over the top from what even I had been imagining. So a little bit of the Lone Ranger.
The Lone Ranger.
Hail, Silver, away!
Listen to those gunshots.
Yes.
A fiery horse with the speed of light, a cloud of dust, and a hearty hi-yo, Silver, the Lone Ranger.
Dan, your grandma was a fine woman. It's too bad she had to go.
She was certainly good to me.
She and your father left you a great heritage.
A heritage?
Yes. They and others like them have handed down to you the right to worship as you choose, and the right to work and profit from your enterprise. They have given you a land where there is true freedom, true equality of opportunity, a nation that is governed by the people, by laws that are best for the greatest number. Your duty, Dan, is to preserve that heritage and strengthen it. That is the heritage and duty of every American.
202-885-8850.
Now you notice that the beginning of the show was Earl Grazer, and the dramatic part was Brace Beamer, who you could tell the difference probably, but that was the Lone Ranger.
Well, as I said, we do want to open it up to questions. There are microphones at either side, and while you make your way to that, I just want to thank everyone who has joined us tonight, but it is always such a great treat for me to hang out with Ed. I mean, it sort of happened by false pretenses. Ed said to me several years ago, you know, kid, you're no joy boy, but you stick with me. There is big money in public radio. What you didn't tell me is it's somebody else's.
Yeah, somebody else.
But well, we'll start on this end. Ed. There's
Okay.
a number of people who want to ask you some things.
Yes.
I came from Chicago. I lived in Chicago as a little kid. I used to, in fact, I was about maybe 5 or 6 years old, and I used to go to bed at 6 o'clock on Sunday night, and I would spend, if I could stay awake, I would spend the next 3.5 hours listening to one show after another. It was just wonderful. And then in about 1954, something called Monitor came along in Chicago. I don't know whether it was anyplace else, and maybe you can address that, but it wiped out all of these shows. It replaced them. And to be honest, the radio was never really the same for me again. My question is, what was this? Did it extend across the country? What was the purpose of this thing? What were they trying to accomplish with it? Because I don't think it lasted very long. It wasn't very successful, apparently. Do you know anything about it?
Monitor was carried nationally. It was a creation of Pat Weaver, who also created the Today Show, and he was the head of NBC at the time. And this was an idea that local stations, other than the big cities, could carry this show on the weekends with only a board operator on duty. It was cheap for the stations to run, and they could get some big names on it. It was a different form, more of magazine-type radio. But radio changed then, and you know, the network, the store like Johnny Dollar and Suspense and those shows all went off by 1962. So you could see the pattern was there. Radio was changing. Everybody, the advertisers were putting the big bucks into television. So radio had to fend the best way they could. Okay. That's what happened.
Okay. We'll go to this
Thank you.
side. Thank you.
Hi, I'm one of those faithful listeners who make the big broadcast #1 on Sunday.
Thank you, sir. Bless your heart.
I love the show. I listen to it every Sunday. But I do have questions about a couple of radio personalities that I seldom hear on the show, Orson Welles and Groucho Marx. For the Campbell Playhouse and the Mercury Theater, Orson Welles created 56 hours of programming, not just War of the Worlds, and did his own adaptation also of Les Miserables. And Groucho Marx, of course, was the longtime host of You Bet Your Life. So I'm wondering, why not Orson Welles and Groucho Marx on the big broadcast?
We have run them. Orson Welles, we did run Les Miserables a few years ago. And we've run some Mercury Theater. We've run Dracula. And I can't quote you offhand. We don't run them every week because a lot of the listeners, I don't think, if we did, we'd run it later in the show. But I will try to find some more Orson Welles. And Groucho Marx, I don't know how much radio we have of him, because that was a television show that was edited for radio. You Bet Your Life was predominantly a TV show.
So the radio show used actual
footage, actual
audio
from the TV show. Yeah,
I see. But very good. Well, thank you for mentioning those.
We shall
things.
try.
Yeah, sir.
At the time, was radio strictly racially segregated? And if that was the case, what were black performers? What were their outlets as a venue? How did they get to be heard? What sort of famous shows would black performers
Rochester is a perfect example on the Jack Benny Show. And if you notice, when you listen to Rochester, always gets the last laugh many times. And somebody was criticizing Benny once about the way he treated his servant, or he called him. And he said, that's not fair. And Benny said, I'll have you know that Rochester, or Eddie Anderson, happens to be the wealthiest black actor in Hollywood these days. So he was well paid. Others had the stereotypical Amos and Andy on radio are two white men. Now, we can't run that now because that's been a no-no ever since I've been at the station. And I think Amos and Andy are hilarious. They got by on television for a while with black actors, but there were limited black actors on radio in those days, but I can't even think of some of the names of them, but they did, like on Johnny Dollar, they have black actors who do like hotel porters or something like that, typecasting.
Yeah.
They don't do that so much anymore, of course.
But there weren't comparable opportunities. This is really sort of the bottom line. Let's see. Was that from this?
I've always liked the one-liner that the true definition of an intellectual is someone who can listen to Rossini's overture to William Tell and not think of the Lone Ranger.
Yeah, you are right. You are right.
But my question, actually, I'm a big fan of the big broadcast, but also of Hot Jazz Saturday Night. And my question is to Mr. Bamberger, what are your sources of records? Are they all from your collection or from the library's collection or a whole mixture?
Oh, never from the library. You mean the Library of Congress when I worked there? No. It's personal collection. Remember what I said about collections keeping you instead of the other way around?
They just applied for food stamps last week.
We need a second baseman. But thank you very much, sir. Yeah, it's the curse of collecting. Yeah. This side.
Thank you. I don't know if there would be any way to quantify how much of old-time radio has been preserved versus what was broadcast. You know, the way we hear sometimes about early silent movies, X% has been preserved. I kind of wonder about that. And also, to Mr. Walker, are there particular shows or particular broadcasts that hasn't been preserved that you know of, but you would really love to turn up somehow?
Well, the broadcasts from the 30s, the early 30s, are limited because they had no tape then. and they had to do them on transcriptions. And I know in the case of Vic and Sade, which was a very popular program, sponsored by Procter & Gamble, Procter & Gamble was moving their facilities or something. Somebody got the bright idea of throwing out all those discs. Little did they know what they had done. And that's how a lot of the old radio stuff comes into being. Guys at radio stations, they might have recorded stuff off the air to run on the air delayed, and they throw them out. And every once in a while, some engineers rummaging around the trash bin will see those discs and take them. And, of course, we get a lot of stuff from Armed Forces Radio, which theoretically you're not supposed to run, but they carried a lot of the old radio shows on the Armed Forces Radio Service, cutting out the commercials.
What Ed says is absolutely true. A lot of material was disposed of.
Oh, yeah.
But it's something that I'm fond of saying is that you can never completely despair of what a finite universe will cough up. That's sort of as an odd way to put it, but the fact that you can't go back and capture anything that wasn't captured, but yet there are stories like the Crosby material we heard earlier. Some of it belonged to Georgie Stoll, who was leading the orchestra of the Woodbury program. Some of the Benny Goodman Camel Caravans from 1939, Johnny Mercer, who was sidekick on that program, had them recorded off air. His family had the discs. Fortunately, Johnny played the parts where he was singing, so the Goodman parts had less surface noise. But I mean, there's stuff out there, and it keeps surfacing. With respect to film versus radio, it's hard to know because film is such a more finite universe, and there's enough documentation. You know what films were produced, but radio was hours and hours and hours all over the country, a lot of it local, so it's hard to know how much was lost.
What's happening, after the 50s, the radio is mostly on tape, and tape has some of the same characteristics as movie film. It dries up after a while, and it's not usable. And that's why it's vitally important to get the stuff digitized, put on CDs. Now, I don't have a big collection. We've moved, and I had to downsize, but I got a fellow in Baltimore who has a tremendous collection, and I confer with him on the phone, and we talk about shows, and one show that's very good that Jack Webb did was Pete Kelly's Blues, which had a Dixieland band in it too, Rob. I don't know if you remember
Indeed
that.
it did.
And it only ran for 13 weeks, and I'm trying to get my hands on those. I've had one or two of them, and they made a movie from that later on in the 50s, But that was a very good show. Every once in a while you'll come across a show that you've been looking for.
Yeah. I think we've time for one more question. I think I'm obliged to go
Thank
on
you.
this side, but
I'd like to
moving on.
thank Ed for bringing back so many memories, not of the 30s, but in my case, the late 40s, when radio was still a very viable media that we did huddle around and listen to these mysteries and comedy shows. But he almost gave me a good segue there, talking about Armed Forces Radio. I don't know if he knows this, but the guy that turned me on to your program, Ed, is Adrian Cronauer of Good Morning America fame, and he's a very, very big fan, and I'm sure wishes he could be here tonight. Thank you so much for all
Thank
you've
you.
done.
I interviewed him. I had him on television when I was doing a show at Channel 8, and he was famous for Good Morning Vietnam. Yeah. And, oh, really?
Yes, sir.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm going to take one more question, just to be civilly disobedient.
Yeah.
One last one.
Hi. Well, I have listened to the big broadcast for a few years now, and I also really love it when you play Jack Benny, and, he's always making fun of on the show how he played the violin, and I was just wondering if he ever actually had any jobs playing the violin, whether he was actually good at playing the violin.
Near the end of his career, he did a series of concerts for charity, and he did play legitimate violin.
His daughter Joan, in her book Sunday Nights at 7, writes about if I'm not mistaken, Ed, I think it's in that book. She writes about how very seriously he was working at the violin.
And the way he scrapes the strings and everything, that's, you know.
It's art. You have to be artful to play bad.
It's like Spike Jones musicians. They were that way too. Yeah. You have to be very good to be very bad.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a pleasure.